If an AI looked at a clay tablet thousands of years old and told you humanity wasn't born the way we think, would you believe it? Probably not. I wouldn't have either. But something happened recently that I can't stop thinking about. A research team fed a damaged Sumerian tablet into Grok, the large language model. What came back wasn't mythology. It wasn't poetry. It read like a record, a list, an account of something being made. And then, according to the people involved, the translation was quietly pulled, not published, not discussed, set aside. So picture this. A single broken tablet, sitting forgotten for over 4,000 years, suddenly tells us things that contradict what we've been taught about where human beings came from. Not a metaphor, not a religious story, a technical description. That's what we're looking at today. And I'll warn you up front, once you see how the pieces fit, you can't unsee it. I'm Dr. James Mercer. This just came in. Here's the situation. We have a clay tablet from ancient Mesopotamia. We have an AI translation that allegedly disturbed the people who commissioned it. And we have a list of questions no mainstream institution wants to answer out loud. Why was the tablet never formally published? What exactly did the translation say about human origins? Why does the language read like an instruction manual instead of a creation myth? Why do at least 3 other ancient cultures, separated by thousands of miles, describe almost the same thing? And why does modern genetics keep stumbling into anomalies that line up with what this tablet supposedly describes? I'll walk you through all of it. But first, subscribe to the channel, because stories like this get buried fast. This is the kind of thing that disappears from the conversation in a week. Now let's go back to where this starts. Before the AI, before the translation, you need to understand what these tablets actually are. That's where the credibility lives. We're talking about ancient Sumer, southern Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. This is the civilization that, as far as we know, invented writing. The earliest scripts date to around 3,400 BC, cuneiform, those wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus. They wrote on clay because clay survives. Paper rots. Stone is heavy. But a baked clay tablet can sit in the dirt for 5,000 years and still be readable. Here's something most people don't realize. The Sumerians weren't writing fairy tales. The overwhelming majority of cuneiform tablets ever recovered, and we've recovered hundreds of thousands, are administrative inventories, receipts, beer rations, land deeds, tax records. These were record keepers, accountants. They documented their world with obsessive bureaucratic precision. So when a Sumerian scribe writes something down, the default assumption shouldn't be, this is myth. Statistically, the default is, this is a record of something that happened. The specific tablet at the center of this story connects to a category of texts scholars link to the Atrahasis epic, the ancient Sumerian account of creation. The conventional academic reading is tidy. The gods grew tired of laboring, so they created humankind to do the work for them. Religious literature, symbolic, allegorical, a primitive people's way of explaining where they came from. That's the official interpretation. It's in every textbook. The gods made man from clay and blood to be a servant. For over a century, that's where the conversation ended. But what if the people who wrote it didn't think they were writing symbolism at all? Here's the real problem, and it's more uncomfortable than it sounds. For most of the last 150 years, the people translating these tablets already believed what they were translating before they started. They came in with an answer. Creation myth, religious poetry, primitive symbolism, and every time they hit an ambiguous word, a broken section, a gap in the clay, they filled it in with something that matched the story they already expected to find. It's not dishonesty, it's how interpretation works, but once that framing is set, it's almost impossible to break. A generation of scholars translates the text as myth. Their students learn the same translations. The textbooks are written, the museum placards are printed, and anyone who reads the signs differently isn't presenting an alternative. They're contradicting 150 years of accumulated consensus. That's not a small thing to do. And here's the detail that should bother everyone. The British Museum holds approximately 130,000 cuneiform tablets. 130,000. Of those, only a fraction have ever been fully translated and formally published. The rest sit in storage, drawers, basements, cataloged, numbered, and unread. A civilization that documented everything: beer rations, land disputes, astronomical observations, and apparently the origins of humankind. We've read maybe 10% of what they left us. Nobody knows what's in the other 90%. And the people who do have access, who work in those basement archives, who hold the keys, have spent their entire careers inside a framework that was decided before any of them were born. They don't see the tablets fresh. They see them through everything that came before, until something came along that didn't have that baggage. The real surprise came when researchers started feeding these texts into large language models. Here's why this matters. An AI like Grok doesn't get tired. It doesn't have a career to protect. It doesn't have a tenure committee deciding whether its interpretation is too controversial. You give it the raw signs, the broken passages, the linguistic data, and ask it to translate without assuming this is religious poetry. A research team ran a set of Atrahasis-related tablets through Grok. I want to be careful here because the people involved have stayed deliberately quiet about who they are. They included the famous creation passage, the one about making humankind. The output was not what they expected. The standard translation reads something like this: "They slaughtered a god and mixed his flesh and blood with clay, and from it humankind was made." Poetic, symbolic, mythological. The AI parsed the same signs differently. It flagged the structure as procedural, sequential. It read like a list of steps. Take this material, combine it with that material, apply this process, wait this interval, repeat 14 times. 14. That number is actually in the Atrahasis text. 14 pieces of clay, 7 on the left, 7 on the right. The standard reading treats it as ritual symbolism. The AI flagged it as a batch, a quantity, a production run. According to the people who saw it, this read like a technical document, a protocol, a description of a process being carried out on purpose, with specified ingredients in measured amounts, repeated a fixed number of times. And here's the part that reportedly stopped the room cold: the clay and the blood of a god. In the AI's parsing, those weren't symbolic substances. The language pattern matched something more like a base material and a living component carrying instructions, a template, something that defines what the resulting thing will be. Think about what that sounds like in modern terms: a base substrate, a carrier of genetic instruction, a measured, repeated process, 14 units per batch. If that interpretation is correct, it changes the entire picture of what this text is. The Sumerians weren't describing a god making a man out of mud. They were describing a procedure. And the question stops being, what does this myth mean? And becomes much harder. How did a Bronze Age scribe come to write down a process that reads like manufacturing? And the story doesn't end there. As the team kept analyzing, things got stranger. Let me walk you through it the way they found it. The roles in the text. In the standard reading, you have gods, the lower gods doing the labor, and then humans created to take over that labor. The AI flagged a distinction the poetic translations smooth over. The text describes 2 separate categories of being, and then a third, the new one, the made one. And the made one is explicitly a hybrid. Part of the original, part of something else. The standard translation says flesh and blood of a god mixed with clay. The procedural reading says existing template plus base material equals a new intermediate form. A hybrid, made deliberately, for a purpose. The purpose itself. Why were they made? The text is blunt about it, and this part survives in every translation. They were made to work. To carry the load the makers no longer wanted to carry themselves. In the myth reading, that's the gods being lazy. But read as a record, that's a labor force, created to specification, for a task. And here's where it gets strange. The text complains. Later passages describe the made ones multiplying, becoming too numerous, becoming a problem. The makers grow irritated by the noise, the growth, the spread of their own creation. And they discuss reducing the population, controlling it. Think about that for a second. A created workforce that grows beyond what was intended, and the makers debating how to cull it. That's not how you'd write a flattering origin myth about yourself. That's how you'd record an inconvenient outcome. Third, and this is the one the team reportedly went quiet over, The tablet includes what reads like a maintenance note, a passage about the made ones having a limited lifespan, a built-in limit. In the myth reading, it's about mortality. Gods are immortal, humans are not, end of story. But the procedural reading flagged it as a specification, a designed limitation, a ceiling deliberately placed on how long the made ones would last, a built-in expiration, designed in, on purpose. And then they noticed something that's hard to explain away. The numbers in the text, the intervals, the quantities, the repetitions, are consistent. They don't drift the way symbolic numbers usually do across different versions of a myth. They stay fixed, like specifications, like real data. Now here's the part that makes this hard to dismiss. The Sumerians weren't the only ones. If this were one weird tablet, you could write it off. One broken text, one strange AI reading, one overexcited research team. But this same story, beings made by other beings, made from existing material, made to serve, given limits, shows up across the ancient world in cultures that had no contact with each other. And when you look at them all together, the pattern doesn't feel like coincidence. Go to the Babylonians, the direct inheritors of Sumerian writing. Same structure. Humankind fashioned from divine blood mixed with earth, made to bear the labor of the gods. Slightly different names, identical process. Not just similar, and structurally, step by step, almost identical. Go further. The ancient Egyptians described Khnum, the ram-headed god, forming human beings on a potter's wheel, shaping them, manufacturing them piece by piece. And in Egyptian belief, every human has a ka, a kind of double, a life force, that was also shaped on that wheel. Two things made at once, a body and something that inhabits the body. Sound familiar? Across the planet, Mesoamerica, the Popol Vuh, the sacred text of the Maya, describes the makers attempting to create humans multiple times. First from mud, which fails, like it dissolves, it can't hold form. Then from wood, which fails, the wooden people are flawed, they have no memory, they can't speak properly, they're destroyed. Finally from maize, and that version works. Read that again. Multiple attempts, failed prototypes, refinement, iteration, until they got a working version. That's not how mythology usually works. Mythology doesn't typically include failure. You don't write a creation story where the god tries and fails twice before getting it right. That's how you describe trial and error. That's how you document a process that took several attempts to perfect. And then there's the Vedic tradition, ancient India, the concept of yugas, vast cycles of time in which humanity rises, degrades, and is periodically reset. The texts describe beings of a higher order who oversee these cycles, who intervene, who allow certain things to continue and end others. The Mahabharata contains passages describing conflicts between beings with weapons that match, almost word for word, descriptions of forces we didn't develop names for until the 20th century. Global destruction followed by deliberate repopulation. 4 separate civilizations, 4 corners of the ancient world. No common origin, no shared trade route, no possibility of one copying from the other. All telling versions of the same story. Made beings, makers, purpose, limits, management, and now the modern data. Geneticists have documented something called mitochondrial Eve, the most recent common maternal ancestor of all living humans. And there are open, published questions in the field about why human genetic diversity is so strangely low compared to other primates. Studies point to population bottlenecks, moments where the human population appears to have crashed to almost nothing, then recovered. The tablets describe makers debating whether to reduce the population of their creation, and the genetics show us that the human population really did, at certain points in history, collapse to almost nothing, then bounce back. A geneticist will tell you a bottleneck is completely normal. Climate, disease, volcanic winter. Maybe that's true, but is it a coincidence that the written record and the genetic record describe the same event? One from the outside looking down, one from the inside looking at the data we left behind? Here's the question the critics never answer satisfactorily. If the AI translation was wrong, if it was just an algorithm misreading ancient text, projecting modern concepts onto symbols that mean something else entirely, Then why wasn't it published? Think about how academia actually works. If you run a tablet through an AI and get back a sensational, obviously flawed translation, what do? You publish it. You write the paper that tears it apart. You become the scholar who caught the machine hallucinating ancient genetics into Bronze Age poetry. That's a career win. That's citations. That's conference invitations. That is not what happened here. Silence. The work wasn't followed up. The procedural interpretation wasn't formally engaged with, not refuted, not analyzed, not even dismissed in print. It was just not picked up. And when one of the people connected to it tried to push the question further, to ask whether we'd been systematically mistranslating these texts for over a century, the institutional response was the same thing it always is when a question gets too close to something uncomfortable. Not an argument, not a counterpoint, just a wall. This isn't new. Look at what happened with the scholars who pushed literal readings of these same Atrahasis passages in the 1970s and 80s. The mainstream response wasn't to engage with their readings line by line. It was to label them fringe, unserious, not worth responding to. The argument was never addressed. The people making it were. Then there's what happened to the tablets themselves. In 2003, during the looting of the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, thousands of cuneiform tablets disappeared. Some were recovered, most were not. Artifacts that had survived 4,000 years were gone in 72 hours. And the international response from the institutions that claimed to be guardians of this heritage was slow in ways that still don't make sense. Several scholars noted privately that some of the missing pieces were among the most sensitive, the most fragmentary, the most likely to raise the kind of questions nobody in the field wanted to answer publicly. And here's something that almost never gets mentioned: the access problem. To work with the cuneiform collections at major institutions, you need credentials, affiliation, approval. You don't walk into the British Museum's storage and start reading tablets. The gatekeeping is real, and it's been real for generations, which means the only people who've had eyes on the full collection are the same people whose careers depend on the existing interpretation being correct. One Assyriologist, someone who worked on these texts for decades, reportedly said in a private conversation that there were passages he had chosen not to translate the way the signs actually read, because of what they implied, because of how it would land. He chose not to translate it the way it actually read. Sit with that for a second. This is where the biggest question arises, and I want you to sit with this because it's bigger than one tablet. If the procedural reading is right, even partly right, then the oldest written documents of human civilization aren't telling us a comforting story about gods and creation. They're telling us we were made, engineered, from an existing template combined with a base material in measured batches for a purpose, given a built-in limit on how long we last, and then watched, managed, and culled when we grew beyond what was intended. That's not a metaphor. That's not a Sunday school story. That's line by line what these texts describe when you remove the assumption that it has to be myth. And here's what I keep coming back to. The Sumerians didn't write fiction. They wrote what happened. Their tablets record beer deliveries and land disputes and astronomical observations with the same flat, bureaucratic tone. There's no separate genre for stories we made up. If a Sumerian scribe wrote it down, he wrote it down because it was true, or because someone told him it was true and he had no reason to doubt them. So either the Sumerians invented, from nothing, a creation story that happens to read exactly like a genetic engineering protocol, thousands of years before we understood genetics, matching independently across 4 separate civilizations on 4 separate continents, or they were writing down what they'd been told, what they remembered, what someone at some point needed them to know. There's a third possibility that nobody in the field will say out loud, that they didn't invent it and they weren't told it secondhand, that they witnessed it, that someone at some point in human prehistory showed them the process, and they wrote it down the only way they knew how, as a record. And if it is true, if we really were made and limited and managed, then there's one question the tablet raises that nobody, not the scholars, not the AI, not anyone, has been able to answer. The makers grew tired of us once. They reduced us once. They built the limit themselves. So what changes when that limit is reached? If this got under your skin the way it got under mine, subscribe right now, because the next tablet I'm looking at is even harder to explain, and you do not want to hear about it secondhand. Tell me in the comments, do you think the translation was buried because it was wrong or because it wasn't? I'm Dr. James Mercer. The moment I have more on this, you'll be the first to know.